Some people inherit kingdoms. Some seize them with steel and silence. Duke Caedric Ashcombe did neither. He simply made every man who stood near power understand, through methods no court record would ever survive long enough to document, that Blackthorne Keep answered to one voice alone, his. The aristocracy called him merciless behind doors they believed were thick enough. They were wrong about the doors. They were wrong about everything. If you stay until the very end of this story, you will understand exactly why the most dangerous man in the kingdom became the most desperate, and desperation, in the hands of a man like Caedric, looked nothing like weakness. The night of the Crimson Assembly began with rain, not the soft, forgiving kind that washed the capital's marble streets into something resembling cleanliness. This was northern rain. Blackthorne rain. It fell in heavy curtains against obsidian walls that had watched 7 generations of Ashcombes rule, scheme, and bury their enemies beneath foundations no architect would ever be permitted to excavate. Thunder cracked above the fortress turrets like a warning the sky itself could not keep to itself, and the torches lining the outer courtyard hissed and flickered as if even fire understood it existed at the Duke's discretion. Inside, the grand hall burned gold. 300 candles suspended from iron chandeliers threw shifting light across a ballroom designed less for celebration and more for theater. Velvet drapes, the color of dried blood, framed towering windows. Long banquet tables groaned beneath roasted game, dark wine, and silver platters no servant dared touch without permission. Military officers stood in rigid clusters, dress swords catching candlelight. Noblemen circulated with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Trading pleasantries sharpened into weapons so finely honed the wounds only appeared hours later, alone, in private. And at the far end of the hall, elevated on a platform carved from Blackthorne granite, Duke Caedric Ashcombe sat in a chair that was not a throne only because calling it one would have required acknowledging a king above him. He did not smile. He did not drink. He watched. Caedric Ashcombe, at 32, carried the face of a man who had burned through whatever softness youth once offered him and decided the ash tasted better. Sharp jaw, sharper eyes, the color of iron left too long in cold water. Dark hair swept back from a forehead lined not with age but with the particular tension of a man who slept, when he slept at all, with one hand resting on the blade beneath his pillow. His dress uniform was black. His boots were black. The signet ring on his left hand bore the Ashcombe crest, a wolf devouring its own chain, and when he turned it slowly between his fingers, men across the room felt their throats tighten without understanding why. He had spoken 4 words since the assembly began. Let them wait longer. That was 90 minutes ago, directed at his steward, Greaves, who stood 3 paces behind the Duke's left shoulder like a man who had long ago accepted that proximity to Caedric Ashcombe was both privilege and death sentence. Greaves cleared his throat carefully. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton has requested a private audience. Twice. Then Pemberton has not yet learned what twice means in this house. And Lady Harcourt wishes to present her daughter. Caedric's gaze swept the ballroom floor without interest. Which one? The younger. Apparently she plays the harp. I don't care if she plays the harp, Greaves. I care if her father's grain shipments reach the northern border before the freeze. Does she control grain shipments? I would assume not, Your Grace. Then she can play the harp somewhere else. Greaves said nothing further. He had served 3 Ashcombe dukes across 4 decades, and the current one was by far the most effective and by far the most impossible to serve. The previous duke had been cruel in the way aristocrats understood, performatively, strategically, with enough charm to make the cruelty feel almost consensual. Caedric dispensed with charm entirely. He identified what he needed, calculated what it cost, and paid in whatever currency the situation demanded. If that currency was fear, he spent it without flinching. If it was violence, he spent it without remembering. The result was a duchy that ran with brutal efficiency. Tax collection operated ahead of schedule. Border skirmishes ended before they became wars. Noble families who had feuded for generations suddenly discovered cooperation when the alternative was explaining their disagreements to the Duke personally. But efficiency had costs the ledgers never recorded. Caedric Ashcombe had no friends. He had subordinates, allies of convenience, and enemies patient enough to wait. His mother had died when he was 11. His father had spent the remaining years teaching him that sentiment was a structural flaw in men who could not afford structural flaws, then died proving it, assassinated at a dinner table by a man he had trusted enough to seat at his right hand. Caedric learned two things that night, watching his father bleed out across white linen while servants screamed and guards arrived 4 minutes too late to matter. Trust was a loan no one ever repaid, and 4 minutes was enough time for everything in the world to end. He had governed accordingly ever since. The ballroom doors opened at 10:30, admitting a gust of rain-soaked wind and a woman no one in the room had been expecting. Lady Seraphina Vale entered Blackthorne Keep the way a blade enters a wound, quietly, precisely, and with damage that would only become apparent once it was far too late to extract. She was tall for a woman of the southern courts, slender in the way hunger and pride produced when they collaborated long enough. Her gown was silver silk, elegant but not extravagant, the kind of dress a woman wore when she wanted to be noticed for what she said rather than what she cost. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and anyone who looked closely enough would have recognized them as paste. Good paste. Expensive enough paste to fool men who only examined women with their expectations rather than their eyes. Her hair was dark auburn, swept into an arrangement that looked effortless and had probably taken an hour. Her face was striking without being conventional. High cheekbones, a mouth that defaulted to something between composure and challenge, and eyes the color of aged whiskey that moved across the grand hall with the specific intensity of a woman cataloging every exit, every weapon, and every man in the room who might become a problem before the night ended. Caedric saw all of this in the span of 4 seconds. He had been trained since childhood to assess threats. Seraphina Vale did not move like a noblewoman arriving at a party. She moved like someone entering hostile territory who had already accepted the possibility that she might not leave. "Greaves, Your Grace, the woman in silver, who is she?" Greaves leaned forward slightly, studying the new arrival with the practiced discretion of a man whose survival depended on knowing things before his employer asked. "Lady Seraphina Vale, Your Grace, daughter of Lord Aldrich Vale. Southern house, old name, nearly bankrupt. She was not on the guest registry." "Then how did she get through my gates?" "I will find out immediately." "No." Caedric's voice dropped half a register, which Greaves recognized as considerably more dangerous than if he had shouted. "Let her move. I want to see where she goes." Seraphina moved through the ballroom the way smoke moved through a burning room. Present everywhere, touching nothing, impossible to catch. She accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant and did not drink it. She smiled at Lord Pemberton's wife with exactly enough warmth to avoid insult and exactly enough distance to prevent conversation. She positioned herself near a marble column where 3 corridors converged, giving her sightlines to the main entrance, the east gallery, and the servants' passage behind the kitchens. Caedric watched her for 27 minutes. During that time, 4 noblemen attempted to engage her. She dismissed each one with a different technique, the first with polite disinterest, the second with a question about his wife that made him retreat immediately, the third with a compliment so layered he did not realize he had been insulted until he was already walking away, and the fourth with nothing but eye contact held 2 seconds longer than comfort allowed. She was, Caedric realized, with something that felt dangerously close to fascination, operating on a level most people in this room could not even perceive. He descended from the platform. The effect was immediate. Conversations faltered. Officers straightened. 3 noblemen who had been laughing too loudly stopped mid-sentence as the Duke moved through the crowd with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush because the world rearranged itself around his pace. Seraphina saw him coming. She did not retreat. She did not adjust her expression. She finished the glass of wine she had been holding untouched for half an hour, set it on a passing tray, and turned to face him the way a chess player turned to face an opponent they had been studying from across the board. "Lady Vale." Caedric stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to read her pulse in the vein along her throat, far enough to maintain the pretense that this was polite. "You were not invited tonight." "I was not," she agreed. Her voice carried the particular calm of someone who had decided in advance that lying would waste both their time. Lord Ashford's invitation was addressed to his cousin. His cousin developed a fever. I did not. So you forged entry into my house using another woman's name. I used another woman's absence. There is a difference. Caedric studied her the way a surgeon studied an incision, with total attention and absolute detachment. Most people who enter Blackthorne uninvited do not leave on their own terms, Lady Vale. Most people who enter Blackthorne were not carrying information you need, Your Grace. The silence between them lasted exactly long enough for 3 surrounding noblemen to find urgent reasons to be elsewhere. What information? Not here. Seraphina glanced at the ballroom without moving her head. You have 11 men in this room whose loyalty you should be questioning. I can name 9 of them. The other 2 I would need another hour to confirm. Caedric's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation, a reassessment, the particular sharpening that happened when a man built entirely for control encountered something he had not predicted. Follow me, he said. He did not wait to see if she obeyed. He turned and walked toward the east corridor, and the crowd parted around him like water dividing for a ship that had never once considered slowing for the current. Seraphina followed. They descended. Blackthorne Keep had been built in layers, each generation adding depth like geological strata compressed by centuries of ambition. The main halls gleamed with polished stone and military precision. Below them, the administrative corridors hummed with cold efficiency. Below those, the catacombs stretched in silence, vaulted stone passages lit by oil lamps that cast more shadow than light, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees and the air tasted of damp iron and something older, something no amount of cleaning would ever fully remove. Caedric moved through the darkness without hesitation. He knew these tunnels the way predators knew their territory, not through memorization, but through something closer to instinct, a spatial awareness built from years of navigating spaces designed to confuse, trap, and kill anyone who did not belong. Seraphina kept pace. Her heels made no sound on the stone floor, and Caedric noted this with clinical interest. She had changed her shoes. Somewhere between this ballroom and the corridor, she had swapped her formal heels for something flat, something quiet, something that allowed her to move through a medieval catacomb without announcing her position. She had planned for this. The realization settled in Caedric's chest like a cold stone. She had not stumbled into Blackthorne. She had engineered her way in with surgical precision, and now she was walking into the most dangerous part of his fortress, as though she had rehearsed the route. He stopped at a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. "The information you mentioned," he said without turning. "You will share it now." "Open the door first." Caedric turned slowly. In the lamplight, his face looked carved from the same stone as the catacomb walls, hard, ancient, and entirely without warmth. "You are in no position to give orders in my house, Lady Vale. And you are in no position to waste time performing authority you have already established, Your Grace. I am here. I followed you into your catacombs willingly. If I intended to threaten you, I would have chosen a method that did not involve walking alone into a stone corridor with a man known for making people disappear. Open the door." Something shifted at the corner of Caedric's mouth. Not a smile. Smiles required warmth, and warmth required something he had cauterized out of himself years ago. But it was the ghost of recognition, the particular stillness that occurred when one predator identified another. He opened the door. The chamber beyond was not what Seraphina expected, though her expression betrayed nothing. It was a war room. Maps covered every wall, territorial boundaries, troop movements, trade routes, supply chains. A long table dominated the center, covered in documents sealed with wax crests from a dozen noble houses. Candles burned in iron sconces, throwing shifting light across intelligence reports, intercepted correspondence, and what appeared to be a detailed accounting of every nobleman currently attending the Crimson Assembly. Their debts, their alliances, their vulnerabilities, and in several cases, their crimes. Caedric Ashcombe was not simply governing his duchy. He was conducting a war that nobody realized had already started. "Speak," he said, closing the door behind them. Seraphina walked to the table. She looked at the documents without touching them, absorbing information the way a strategist absorbed terrain. "Lord Ashford, Lord Pemberton, and Viscount Hale are coordinating with the Crown to strip your military authority within the year. They have written assurances from Prince Adrian Valamont that Blackthorne's northern territories will be redistributed to loyalist houses once you are removed. Removed is a generous word. They used a more specific one. I chose to be diplomatic. Caedric leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed. His posture was relaxed. His eyes were not. And how does the daughter of a bankrupt southern lord come to possess intelligence that my own network has not confirmed? Your network is compromised. Seraphina met his gaze directly. 3 of your intelligence operatives report to Ashford through a financial intermediary in the capital. They have been feeding you accurate information on irrelevant matters to maintain credibility while withholding everything that actually threatens you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, pressurized, the kind of silence that preceded either violence or revelation. Names, Caedric said quietly. I need something first. You need to understand that you are standing in a room beneath a fortress, surrounded by men who answer to me and no one else, Lady Vale. You need nothing except my continued willingness to let you speak. I need protection. Seraphina's voice did not waver. My father's debts have been purchased by Lord Ashford. He intends to use them as leverage to force my marriage to his son, a man whose previous 2 wives both died of causes their physicians were discouraged from examining too carefully. I came to Blackthorne because you are the only man in this kingdom powerful enough to refuse Ashford and ruthless enough to make that refusal permanent. Caedric studied her for a long time. The candles shifted. Shadows moved across the walls like living things. Somewhere above them, 300 aristocrats danced and drank and whispered, entirely unaware that the foundations beneath their feet contained a conversation that would reshape every alliance in the kingdom. You are asking me to go to war for you. I am asking you to go to war for yourself. I simply happen to be useful enough to survive it. Before Caedric could respond, a sound cut through the catacomb silence. Footsteps, rapid and uneven, approaching from the eastern passage. Caedric's hand moved to the blade at his hip with a speed that made Seraphina understand viscerally why men feared him. It was not the violence. It was the absence of hesitation. Between the sound and the weapon, there was no gap, no consideration, no decision, no moral calculation. Just reflex shaped by years of living in a world where the space between threat and response determined whether you survived the night. The door burst open. 2 soldiers dragged a man between them, Lord Marcus Crane, a minor nobleman from the Western Territories, his face bleeding, his formal coat torn, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a man who had been caught doing something he understood would cost him everything. Your Grace, the senior soldier's voice was clipped professional. We found Lord Crane in the armory passage. He was carrying these. He held up a bundle of documents bound in black cord. Caedric took them, read them. His face did not change, but something behind it went very still. The kind of stillness that preceded earthquakes, the kind that made the air itself feel heavier. These are deployment schedules for my border garrisons, he said softly. Exact numbers, exact positions, exact rotation timing. He looked at Crane. You were delivering these to Ashford. Crane tried to speak. Blood and saliva made the words thick, half-formed. Your Grace, I can explain. I was compelled. My family. Your family. Caedric set the documents on the table. His voice had dropped to the particular register that Greaves privately called the killing quiet. Your family has held land in my territories for 3 generations because my grandfather allowed it. Your sons attend academy because I fund it. Your wife wears jewelry purchased with grain subsidies I authorized. And you repay this by handing my military positions to a man who intends to burn my house to the ground. Please. Crane dropped to his knees. Tears cut lines through the blood on his face. I had no choice. They threatened my children. You must understand. I understand everything, Crane. Caedric drew his sword. The sound of steel clearing leather filled the stone chamber like a sentence being pronounced. I understand that you had a choice between your fear of them and your fear of me. And you chose wrong. What happened next took 11 seconds. Seraphina did not look away. She stood 3 feet from a man being executed in a catacomb beneath a ballroom where violins still played, and she watched with the unwavering focus of a woman who understood that looking away would not undo what she was seeing. It would only prove she was too weak to survive what came after. When it was finished, Caedric stood in silence, blood on his blade and none on his face. The mark of a man who had done this enough times to understand the geometry of violence. He turned to Seraphina. She expected rage. She expected threats. She expected to become the next body cooling on catacomb stone because she had witnessed something no outsider was ever meant to see. Instead, Caedric sheathed his sword, looked at her with eyes that held no apology and no explanation, and said, "Now you belong to me." The words landed like a door closing. Not with anger, not with triumph, with the absolute, unquestioned certainty of a man who had just calculated every possible future branching from this moment and determined that every single one required her to remain within his reach. Seraphina held his gaze. Blood pooled 3 feet from her silver shoes. The candles flickered. The dead man's hand still twitched against stone. "I belong to myself, Your Grace." Caedric stepped closer, close enough that she could smell iron and smoke and something beneath both that was purely, dangerously him. "You walked into my fortress uninvited. You descended into my catacombs willingly. You watched me kill a man and did not flinch. Every exit from this room runs through men who take orders from me alone." He paused, studying her face with the focus of a man examining a map for routes he had not yet considered. "You belong to yourself the way a flame belongs to itself, until the wind decides otherwise. Then I suggest you be very careful about which direction you blow, Duke Ashcombe." Seraphina's voice was steady. Her hands were not, but she held them at her sides with the discipline of a woman who had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury survivors could not afford. Because flames that are caged tend to burn the cage first. For the first time all evening, something crossed Caedric's face that resembled genuine surprise. He studied her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned to the soldiers waiting by the door. "Escort Lady Vale to the East Wing. She is to be given chambers, clothing, and anything she requires." He paused. "She is not to leave." Seraphina straightened her spine. "For how long?" Caedric looked at her over his shoulder. The lamplight carved his face into something that was half shadow, half blade. "Until I decide otherwise." The soldiers moved. Seraphina moved with them, not because she chose to, but because the architecture of power in that room had rearranged itself around her in the time it took a man to die, and she understood with perfect clarity that resistance now would accomplish nothing except confirming that she could be broken. She would not give him that. As she reached the door, she stopped, did not turn, spoke to the stone wall ahead of her with a voice that carried the quiet defiance of a woman who had survived worse men than Caedric Ashcombe and intended to survive him too. "The names you wanted, your compromised operatives, Gareth Sable, Dominic Pratt, and the one you call Finch." She paused. "Consider it a down payment." Then she walked into the darkness of the eastern corridor, and the door closed behind her with the sound of something ancient and irreversible falling into place. Caedric stood alone in the war room. The dead man cooled at his feet. The documents lay scattered across the table. Somewhere above him, the Crimson Assembly continued. 300 aristocrats performing loyalty they did not feel beneath chandeliers paid for with taxes they resented. Dancing on a floor built over catacombs they pretended did not exist. He looked at the blood on his sword, then at the door where Seraphina had disappeared. For 29 years, Caedric Ashcombe had understood the world through a single principle: control everything, need nothing, trust no one. It had kept him alive when his father's trust killed him. It had kept Blackthorne standing when every noble house in the kingdom wanted it brought to rubble. It had made him the most feared man in the kingdom and the most alone, and he had accepted that trade with the cold clarity of a man who understood that the price of safety was solitude. But standing in the candlelit silence of his own catacombs, watching the door where a woman he had known for less than 2 hours had just handed him intelligence, his own network failed to produce, challenged him to his face in a room where men begged for their lives, and walked away without once lowering her eyes. Caedric Ashcombe felt something he had not felt in years: uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a man who had built his entire empire on the elimination of doubt, was the most dangerous thing in the world. He picked up the documents Crane had been carrying, studied the deployment schedules that should never have left Blackthorne's walls, traced the names Seraphina had given him, Sable, Pratt, Finch, and felt the slow, cold weight of confirmation settling into his chest as details aligned, patterns emerged, and the shape of a conspiracy far larger than a single traitor with stolen papers revealed itself in the margins. Someone was not just spying on Blackthorne. Someone was building the architecture for its destruction, and Caedric was going to find them. But first, he needed the woman in the East Wing to stay alive long enough to tell him everything she knew, which meant keeping her close, which meant keeping her inside Blackthorne's walls, which meant protecting a woman he did not trust from enemies he had not yet identified using resources that might already be compromised. He cleaned his blade, sheathed it, climbed the stone stairs back toward the ballroom, where music still played and candles still burned, and the aristocracy still smiled their practiced smiles. And as he stepped through the hidden door behind the East Gallery, resuming his position above the assembly as though he had never left, Greaves leaned close and whispered, "Your Grace, a rider has arrived from the capital. The Crown has formally announced Prince Adrian Valamont's intent to claim a bride from the Southern Territories." Caedric's hand stopped on the arm of his chair. "Which bride?" Greaves hesitated. It was the first time in 11 years of service that Caedric had seen the man hesitate. "Lady Seraphina Vale, Your Grace." The grand hall glittered below. 300 candles, 300 masks, 300 lies burning in perfect formation, and somewhere in the east wing of Blackthorne Keep, locked behind stone walls and iron doors, the woman the Crown itself intended to claim slept under the Duke's roof, carrying secrets that could dismantle every alliance in the kingdom. Caedric Ashcombe looked out over his assembly, and for the first time in his reign, the most powerful man in the room realized he was no longer playing a game he controlled. Greaves had served the Ashcombe bloodline long enough to recognize the exact moment a duke stopped calculating and started deciding. The difference was subtle, a shift in the jaw, a stillness in the hands, a particular quality of silence that made the air in the room feel like it had been sealed inside a tomb. He saw it now in Caedric's face, and the old steward took one measured step backward, because proximity to an Ashcombe in the moment of decision was not a place any man with functioning survival instincts wanted to occupy. "When did the rider arrive?" Caedric said. 40 minutes ago, Your Grace. He carried the Crown's formal seal." "And you waited 40 minutes to tell me?" "You were in the catacombs, Your Grace." "I do not enter the catacombs." Caedric looked at him. Greaves held the gaze with the practiced composure of a man who understood that explaining himself further would only make things worse. "Bring me the letter." "It is already on your desk." Caedric rose from his chair. Below him, the Crimson Assembly continued its performance. Couples spinning across marble floors, laughter pitched at exactly the volume required to suggest enjoyment without revealing desperation, wine flowing into glasses held by hands that trembled for reasons having nothing to do with celebration. He watched the room the way a man watched a fire he had not yet decided whether to let burn or extinguish. Then he left. He did not announce his departure. He did not excuse himself. He simply ceased to be present, and the assembly adjusted to his absence the way a body adjusted to a wound, with a flood of nervous energy rushing to fill the space where pressure had been. The letter waited on his desk in the north study, sealed with crimson wax bearing the royal crest. Caedric broke it with his thumb and read it standing, his back to the fire, his shadow stretching across the floor like something trying to escape. The language was diplomatic. The meaning was not. Prince Adrian Valamont, second in line to the throne, had expressed formal intent to take Lady Seraphina Vale as his bride. The union would consolidate southern territories under Crown influence. Lord Aldrich Vale's debts, currently held by Lord Ashford, would be absorbed into royal accounts as part of the dowry negotiation. The Crown expected all noble houses to facilitate the arrangement without obstruction. The final paragraph contained a single sentence that Caedric read 3 times. Any party currently providing shelter or hospitality to Lady Vale is expected to release her to Crown custody within 14 days. He set the letter on the desk, poured himself whiskey from the decanter beside the window, did not drink it, held the glass and stared at the amber liquid catching firelight while his mind worked through corridors far more dangerous than the ones beneath his fortress. The Crown was not asking. The Crown was telling. And the 14-day window was not courtesy. It was a fuse. If he released Seraphina, he handed the only person who could identify his compromised intelligence network directly to the men who had compromised it. Ashford would bury her in a royal marriage. The conspiracy against Blackthorne would continue unopposed. Within a year, maybe less, he would be fighting a war against enemies who already knew his troop positions, supply lines, and defensive vulnerabilities. If he kept her, he was openly defying the Crown. Every alliance he maintained through careful neutrality would fracture. The noble houses currently hedging their loyalty would be forced to choose sides, and the target on Blackthorne, already considerable, would expand to a size that made survival a matter of mathematics rather than strategy. Caedric drank the whiskey. Both options led to destruction. The only variable was velocity. He needed a third option. And the woman who might help him build one was locked in the East Wing, probably already calculating how to use his predicament against him. The East Wing of Blackthorne Keep had been designed for confinement, dressed as hospitality. The chambers were spacious, elegantly furnished, warmed by fires that servants maintained at precise intervals. The bed linens were silk. The windows offered views of the northern mountains that would have been breathtaking if they were not also fitted with iron bars forged to look decorative. Seraphina was standing at one of those windows when Caedric entered without knocking at midnight. She did not turn. She had heard his footsteps in the corridor, measured, deliberate, the particular cadence of a man who walked like he expected floors to hold simply because they belonged to him. She had counted 3 heartbeats between his last step and the door opening. He had paused. He had been deciding something. "You read the letter," she said to the window. Caedric closed the door. "You knew it was coming." Now she turned. In the firelight, stripped of the ballroom's silver armor, she looked different. Not softer. Seraphina Vale was constructed from materials that did not soften, but more visible. The paste diamonds were gone. Her hair was down, dark auburn falling across shoulders wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown 2 sizes too large. She looked like a woman who had stopped performing and started surviving. "I knew Adrian would move quickly," she said. "He does not want me. He wants what I represent, a southern alliance that gives the Crown control over territories they have been trying to absorb for a decade. And yet you chose to come here instead of negotiating with the Crown directly. The Crown does not negotiate with women, Your Grace. It acquires them." Caedric leaned against the door frame. The distance between them was 8 feet. It felt like considerably less. "You understand the position you have put me in." "I understand the position you were already in. I simply made it visible. If I release you, I lose my only source of intelligence on a conspiracy designed to destroy me." "Yes." "If I keep you, I declare war on the Crown." "Also, yes." "And you are comfortable being the fulcrum on which that decision balances." Seraphina crossed her arms. The borrowed gown slipped slightly on one shoulder. She did not adjust it. "Comfort is a word for people who have choices, Duke Ashcombe. I have a man who wants to buy me, a prince who wants to own me, and a duke who wants to use me. I am not the fulcrum. I am the currency. The only power I have is choosing which transaction I survive." The words landed in the room like a blade driven into wood, embedded, vibrating, impossible to ignore. Caedric studied her face for a reaction that matched the statement. He found none. She had delivered the assessment of her own commodification with the flat precision of a woman who had stopped being wounded by the truth and started weaponizing it. "What do you propose?" he said. "Keep me. Publicly. Not as a prisoner. As a guest under Blackthorne's formal protection. Invoke the old territorial laws. A nobleman who shelters a citizen of his territories is not required to surrender them to the Crown without adjudication." "You are not a citizen of my territories." "My mother was born in Thornfield. It is within Blackthorne's eastern boundary. I can document the lineage." "You already have, I assume." "The documents are in the lining of the traveling case I arrived with. I had them prepared before I left the South." Caedric exhaled through his nose, a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. "You walked into my fortress with forged entry documents, intelligence on my compromised agents, and legal precedent for your own protection already sewn into your luggage. You would prefer I arrived unprepared? I would prefer to understand what you actually want, Lady Vale, because no one executes a plan this precise for simple survival. Survival is reactive. What you are doing is architectural. Seraphina held his gaze. For the first time since she had entered Blackthorne, something shifted in her expression. Not vulnerability exactly, but the ghost of it. The shadow of something kept behind walls as thick as the ones surrounding them. I want what you want, she said quietly. Control over my own fate. The ability to walk into a room and know that no one in it can sell me, trade me, or dispose of me without consequence. You were born into that power. I am building it from nothing. Those are not different ambitions. They are different starting positions. The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward. Caedric watched her the way a man watched a weapon he was not yet certain was pointed at him or offered for his use. You will give me everything you know about the conspiracy, he said. Names, networks, financial channels, communication routes. Everything. In exchange for what? My protection. Your protection is a cage with better furniture, Your Grace. My protection is the only reason you will still be breathing when Prince Adrian's men arrive. And they will arrive. Caedric pushed off the doorframe and stepped into the room. 1 step. 2. The distance closed like a wound being sutured. You have 14 days before the crown demands your surrender. In 14 days, I need to dismantle a conspiracy that has been growing inside my own house for years. Neutralize 3 compromised intelligence agents without alerting whoever recruited them, and construct a legal and military position strong enough to justify defying a direct royal command. I cannot do any of that if you are bargaining with me over terms like a merchant haggling in a market square. Then stop treating me like merchandise and start treating me like what I am. And what is that? The only ally you have who walked into this situation with her eyes open. The silence stretched. Caedric stood close enough now to see the faint scar below her left ear. Thin, precise, the kind of mark left by a blade held too close by someone who wanted to frighten rather than kill. He filed it away without comment. Every detail about this woman was currency. He was not yet certain who would be spending it. You will have access to the North Study between the hours of 6 and midnight, he said finally. You will review the intelligence I have gathered on the conspiracy and identify every gap, every inconsistency, and every connection I have missed. You will eat meals in the East Wing. You will not wander the castle without escort. Am I a guest or a prisoner? You are an asset. Assets are protected according to their value. How generous. Generosity is a performance, Lady Vale. Protection is a calculation. I do not perform. He turned and walked to the door. His hand was on the iron handle when her voice stopped him. Duke Ashcombe. He paused but did not turn. The man you killed tonight, in the catacombs, Lord Crane. Did you know he had a daughter? Caedric's hand tightened on the handle. The metal was cold. Everything in Blackthorne was cold. He had 2. And what happens to them now? Their father committed treason. Their lands are forfeit. They will be relocated to a dependent estate and provided for, but they will never hold title or property again. 2 girls who lose everything because their father made a choice they had no part in. Caedric turned now. His face was stone. If I allowed sentiment to override consequence, I would be dead inside a year and every person who depends on Blackthorne's stability would be destroyed alongside me. Crane made his choice. His daughters will pay for it. That is not cruelty. That is the cost of living in a world where choices have weight. I know exactly what world I live in. Seraphina's voice did not waver, but something in it had changed, hardened, compressed, like iron being forced into shape. I am simply noting that you and I are standing on the same ground, Duke Ashcombe. You tell yourself control protects the people beneath you. I tell myself survival justifies the alliances I build. We are both lying, and we both know it. Caedric looked at her for a long time. The fire had burned low. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, like witnesses to a conversation neither of them would admit happened. Then he left without another word. 3 days passed. 3 days of controlled demolition. Caedric moved through the intelligence Seraphina provided with the methodical brutality of a surgeon cutting away necrotic tissue. Gareth Sable was the first to fall, intercepted at dawn on the second day carrying encrypted correspondence to a handler in the capital. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. Sable broke in 90 minutes, but Caedric let it continue because the information that emerged after the breaking point was always the most valuable. Men who had exhausted their strategies for self-preservation stopped curating their confessions and started simply emptying. What Sable emptied changed everything. The conspiracy was not Ashford's. Ashford was a tool, wealthy, ambitious, and stupid enough to believe he was the architect of something that had been designed by hands far more capable than his. The true orchestration ran through a network of financial intermediaries, military contractors, and political operatives that converged at a single point, Chancellor Beaumont. Caedric received this information in his war room at midnight, sitting across from documents that mapped a betrayal so comprehensive it bordered on artistic. Beaumont had served as Blackthorne's political chancellor for 9 years. He had negotiated treaties, managed diplomatic relations, and advised 3 major territorial decisions that had shaped the duchy's current power structure. He was the closest thing Caedric had to a trusted counselor, which meant, of course, that he was the most dangerous person in the fortress. Seraphina was sitting across from him when the realization fully formed. She had been reviewing intercepted financial records for 6 hours, cross-referencing transaction patterns with the name Sable had surrendered. Her hair was tied back, her eyes were bloodshot. She had not eaten since midday, and when Caedric pushed a plate of bread and cold meat across the table toward her, she looked at it, looked at him, and resumed working without comment. "Beaumont," she said at 1:30. She set down a document and pressed her fingertips against her eyelids. Every significant financial transfer to Ashford's intermediary network originated from accounts that Beaumont controls. He has been funding the conspiracy against you with your own diplomatic treasury. Caedric said nothing for 30 seconds. The candles burned, the maps watched from the walls. Somewhere above them, Blackthorne Keep slept the uneasy sleep of a fortress that did not know its chancellor was the enemy. "How long?" he said. "At least 4 years, possibly 6. He has been patient. Whatever he is building, he did not expect to trigger it this soon." "Then something forced his timeline." "You did." Seraphina looked at him. "You invited the southern houses to the Crimson Assembly. You brought potential allies into Blackthorne that Beaumont had been carefully isolating you from." He panicked. "The stolen deployment schedules, Crane's betrayal, Adrian's marriage claim, it is all acceleration. He is trying to collapse your position before you can build the alliances that would make you untouchable." Caedric stood, walked to the map on the eastern wall, stared at the border territories with the focus of a man reading his own death sentence and deciding which words to object to. "If I arrest Beaumont now, I confirm the Crown's narrative that Blackthorne is unstable. The noble houses will scatter. Adrian will have justification to march. If you do not arrest Beaumont, he continues to dismantle your infrastructure from within. Then I need to do something between arresting and ignoring. You need to make him expose himself, voluntarily, publicly, in a way that makes every noble house in the kingdom understand that the threat was never Blackthorne. It was the man standing behind it holding the knife." Caedric turned from the map. Seraphina was watching him with an expression he could not immediately classify. Not admiration, not fear, not the careful neutrality she normally maintained. Something raw. Something that looked like the particular intensity of a person who had finally encountered a problem worthy of everything she was capable of. "You have a plan," he said. "I have the beginning of one. Tell me." Seraphina stood, walked to the map beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin and smell the ink on her fingers, and see the exhaustion in her eyes that she refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging exhaustion meant admitting she had limits, and admitting limits meant becoming vulnerable. And vulnerability in her world, in their world, was an invitation for annihilation. She pointed to the southern territories. "Prince Adrian's marriage claim gives him legal authority to demand my transfer. But if I am already bound by a formal alliance to a northern house, the claim becomes contested. Contested claims require adjudication. Adjudication takes months. What kind of formal alliance? Seraphina lowered her hand, met his eyes. In the candlelight, standing inches apart over maps that charted the geography of their mutual destruction, something passed between them that neither acknowledged and neither could deny. Marriage, she said. The word detonated silently. Caedric did not move, did not blink, did not do any of the things a man was supposed to do when a woman he had known for 72 hours suggested binding their lives together in a strategic alliance that would make enemies of the crown, targets of the aristocracy, and partners in a war neither of them was certain they could win. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that I marry a woman I imprisoned in my own castle 3 days ago. I am suggesting that we formalize an alliance that already exists. You need my intelligence. I need your protection. Marriage converts a hostage situation into a political position that the crown cannot dismantle without admitting they lost. Marriage also converts you from currency into a permanent fixture in my house, which is precisely why it works. You cannot sell a wife the way you can sell a prisoner. Adrian cannot claim a duchess, and Beaumont cannot isolate you from an ally who lives inside your walls." Caedric stared at her. The mathematics were sound, the strategy was elegant. The fact that it had been proposed by a woman who had walked into Blackthorne carrying her own legal documentation and intelligence dossier suggested it had been part of her architecture from the very first moment she stepped through his gates. "You planned this," he said. "I planned for the possibility. There is no difference." "There is an enormous difference, Duke Ashcombe. Planning for a possibility means I was prepared. Planning it means I was manipulating you. If I were manipulating you, I would not have told you about Beaumont. I would have let him destroy you and negotiated my freedom from the wreckage. The logic was flawless, which made it more dangerous, not less." "And if I refuse," Caedric said, "then in 11 days the crown demands my surrender. You either comply and lose your only intelligence advantage, or you refuse and fight a war against the crown, Ashford, Adrian, and Beaumont simultaneously with no political legitimacy and no allies." Seraphina paused. "Marriage gives you legitimacy. Legitimacy gives you time. Time gives you the opportunity to dismantle the conspiracy from within rather than fighting it from without." Caedric looked at the map, at the territories that had been Ashcombe land for 7 generations, at the borders his father had died to protect and his grandfather had killed to establish, at the kingdom that wanted him destroyed not because he was cruel, but because he was effective. And effectiveness in the hands of a man who could not be controlled was the most terrifying thing the aristocracy could imagine. He looked at Seraphina, and he saw, with the crystalline clarity that came only in moments when every possible future collapsed into a single point, that this woman was either the most valuable ally he would ever possess or the most sophisticated weapon ever aimed at his chest. Both options required the same response. "Greaves!" he called. The steward appeared in the doorway within seconds. He had been waiting outside. He was always waiting outside. "Your Grace." "Summon the magistrate. Draft the territorial protection invocation, and prepare the chapel for a binding ceremony within 48 hours. Greaves looked at Caedric, looked at Seraphina, looked back at Caedric with the expression of a man who had survived 4 decades of Ashcombe decisions and recognized that this one would either save the house or end it. "The chapel, Your Grace." "You heard me?" Greaves bowed and vanished. Seraphina exhaled. It was the first uncontrolled breath Caedric had observed from her, a single crack in the architecture of composure she had maintained since the moment she walked through Blackthorne's gates. It lasted half a second. Then it was gone, sealed behind walls rebuilt faster than they had fallen. "We should discuss terms," she said. "We should." Caedric stepped closer, close enough that the space between them felt like a loaded weapon. "But not tonight. Tonight, you should understand one thing clearly, Lady Vale." "And what is that?" "This arrangement changes nothing about who you are inside these walls. You will have the title. You will have the protection. You will have access to every resource Blackthorne can provide, but you will not have my trust. Trust is a door I sealed years ago, and I have no intention of reopening it for a woman who engineered her way into my fortress carrying blueprints for her own installation." Seraphina met his gaze without flinching. "I am not asking for your trust, Duke Ashcombe. I am asking for your intelligence. Trust is what people offer when they have nothing more useful to give. Caedric almost smiled. Almost. The muscles moved, the impulse fired, and then something older and colder intercepted it before it reached his face. He turned away, walked to the door. 48 hours, he said over his shoulder. Then the kingdom finds out what happens when two people who refuse to be owned decide to belong to the same side. He walked into the corridor, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Behind him, in the war room filled with maps and candles and the architecture of a conspiracy that stretched across the entire kingdom, Seraphina Vale stood alone and pressed both hands flat against the table to stop them from shaking. Not from fear. From the devastating recognition that the most dangerous thing she had ever done was not walking into Blackthorne Keep or descending into its catacombs or watching a man die 3 feet from her silver shoes. The most dangerous thing she had ever done was proposing an alliance with a man whose eyes, for one unguarded fraction of a second, had looked at her not as currency, not as a weapon, not as a strategic asset to be deployed and discarded, but as a person. And in a world designed to consume people whole, being seen was the most terrifying form of exposure there was. Outside the fortress walls, a rider was already galloping south through the rain, carrying word to Prince Adrian Valamont that the Duke of Blackthorne had not only refused to surrender Lady Seraphina Vale, he was marrying her. And the kingdom, every lord, every soldier, every spy, every traitor, every architect of conspiracy and ambition, held its breath. Because when the most powerful man in the north and the most dangerous woman in the south bound themselves together inside a fortress, the crown could not breach. The rules governing every alliance, every treaty, and every claim of power in the kingdom ceased to exist. And new rules, written in iron and fire, and something neither Caedric nor Seraphina was yet willing to name, were about to take their place. The ceremony took place at dawn on the 7th day. No flowers, no musicians, no procession of noble witnesses dressed in ancestral silks, whispering blessings they did not mean. The binding hall of Blackthorne Keep held 17 people: Caedric, Seraphina, Greaves, the magistrate, 2 territorial witnesses required by law, and 11 armed soldiers positioned at every entrance, because the Duke of Blackthorne did not conduct even his own marriage without calculating the defensive geometry of the room. Seraphina wore a dark blue gown, pulled from the castle's stores. It fit imperfectly, too loose at the shoulders, slightly too long at the hem, and she had altered nothing. She stood before the magistrate with the posture of a woman entering a negotiation she had already won in the eyes of someone who understood that winning and surviving were not the same thing. Caedric wore black. He always wore black. The signet ring on his left hand caught the thin morning light filtering through narrow windows. And when the magistrate asked if he entered the binding of his own will and sovereign authority, he answered with a single word that sounded less like consent and more like a door being bolted from the inside. Yes. It was done in 11 minutes, no vows beyond the legal minimum, no kiss, no moment of shared tenderness designed to make the arrangement feel like something it was not. When the magistrate declared the binding complete, Caedric signed the territorial document, handed the pen to Seraphina, and watched her signature join his on parchment that would be copied and distributed to every noble house in the kingdom before nightfall. Duchess Seraphina Ashcombe. The name existed now, inked into legal record, woven into the political fabric of the kingdom with the permanence of a blade sunk to the hilt. Whatever happened next, war, assassination, the slow grinding machinery of aristocratic revenge, could not undo what 11 minutes and 2 signatures had accomplished. Caedric looked at his wife. Seraphina looked at the door. Neither of them smiled. The first 3 days after the binding passed in the controlled frenzy of a fortress preparing for siege without admitting it was preparing for siege. Caedric moved through Blackthorne like a machine stripped of everything except function. He restructured garrison rotations using new deployment schedules that only he and his senior commander, Captain Aldrich Voss, possessed. He severed the financial channels Beaumont controlled by redirecting territorial tax collection through a secondary treasury Greaves had maintained since Caedric's father's time. A shadow ledger nobody knew existed because Greaves understood that the value of a secret was directly proportional to the number of people who did not know it existed. Seraphina worked alongside him, not beside him, alongside. The way two weapons operated in parallel without requiring coordination because their trajectories were already aligned. She dismantled the intelligence network Sable had exposed, tracing each compromised node backward through layers of intermediaries until the architecture of Beaumont's infiltration became visible in its entirety. It was elegant. Caedric could admit that privately, in the silence of his own assessment, even as the elegance sickened him. Beaumont had not simply planted spies. He had built a parallel information infrastructure that mirrored Blackthorne's legitimate intelligence operations so precisely that the two systems were nearly indistinguishable. Reports flowed through both. Analysis emerged from both. The difference was that one system served Caedric and the other served whatever Beaumont intended to replace him with. On the fourth day after the binding, Beaumont requested a private audience. Caedric granted it. The Chancellor arrived at the North Study at precisely 2 p.m, dressed in the understated gray wool he favored, a man who had built his career on the appearance of modesty. Beaumont was 53, silver-haired, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation. His face had the particular quality of permanent composure that came from decades of saying one thing while thinking another without ever allowing the discrepancy to reach his expression. He bowed. "Your Grace, and may I extend formal congratulations on your binding. A surprising development, but not, I think, an unwise one." Caedric was standing at the window. He did not turn. "Sit down, Beaumont." Beaumont sat. He crossed one leg over the other with the casual precision of a man settling into a conversation he believed he controlled. "The kingdom is in considerable discussion regarding your decision. The Crown has not yet issued a formal response, which suggests they are calculating rather than reacting. Prince Adrian, I am told, received the news with restraint." Define restraint. He broke a mirror and dismissed his valet. By Adrian's standards, that constitutes remarkable composure. Caedric turned from the window. He looked at Beaumont the way he had looked at him 1,000 times across 9 years of service, with the measured attention of a man evaluating a tool's reliability. But this time, beneath the surface of that assessment, something else operated. Something colder. Something that had spent 3 sleepless nights reading intercepted financial records and tracing the signature of a man who had been dismantling Blackthorne from the inside while sitting in this very chair, in this very room, offering counsel with the practiced sincerity of a physician poisoning his own patient. "What is the Crown's likely response?" Caedric said. "Diplomatic pressure initially. They will challenge the territorial protection invocation. Their legal scholars will argue that Lady Vale's, forgive me, the Duchess's, maternal lineage does not constitute sufficient grounds for territorial citizenship under current statutes. And will they win that argument? The precedent is ambiguous. It depends on which magistrate adjudicates and which interpretation of the Thornfield records they accept." Beaumont paused with the calibrated timing of a man who knew when silence created more pressure than words. "Your Grace, if I may speak candidly." "You have been speaking candidly for 9 years, Beaumont. Why would I expect you to stop now?" "This marriage. It was strategically sound under the immediate circumstances, but it has accelerated timelines that would have been better managed slowly. The Southern houses now see you as aggressive rather than defensive. The Crown sees provocation rather than protection, and your own council is divided on whether the Duchess represents an asset or a liability. My council's division is not your concern. With respect, Your Grace, your council's cohesion is precisely my concern. It is what you appointed me to maintain." Caedric studied him. 9 years. 9 years of sitting across from this man, receiving his analysis, trusting his assessment of threats and opportunities, and the complex political mathematics that govern survival among the aristocracy. 9 years during which Beaumont had smiled exactly this smile, spoken in exactly this measured tone, and delivered counsel that was always accurate enough to maintain credibility while subtly, incrementally, imperceptibly steering Blackthorne toward a position of increasing isolation. The masterwork was not the betrayal. The masterwork was the patience. "I need a complete assessment of our defensive position," Caedric said. "Military, financial, political. On my desk within 48 hours. "Of course, Your Grace." Beaumont stood, bowed. walked to the door with the unhurried stride of a man who believed his performance remained convincing. Beaumont, the Chancellor stopped, did not turn. The angle of his shoulders shifted precisely 2 degrees, a microscopic adjustment that most observers would have missed entirely, but that Caedric registered with the attention of a man who had spent his life reading bodies the way scholars read texts. Your Grace. The assessment should include an analysis of internal vulnerabilities. I want to know who in this fortress might be compromised. Beaumont turned. His expression was flawless. Concern, loyalty, the slight furrow of a brow belonging to a man troubled by the same questions his duke was asking. You suspect internal compromise? I suspect everything. It is what keeps me alive. Indeed it is, Your Grace. Beaumont bowed once more and left. Caedric stood motionless for 60 seconds after the door closed. Then he walked to the desk, opened the lower drawer, and removed a document Seraphina had compiled the night before. A complete financial reconstruction of every transaction Beaumont had authorized over the past 4 years, cross-referenced with every intelligence failure, every diplomatic misstep, and every decision that had resulted in Blackthorne losing an ally, a trade route, or a strategic position. The correlation was perfect, not approximate, not suggestive, perfect. Every financial transfer preceded a specific outcome. Every outcome weakened Blackthorne in a specific way. And the cumulative effect, visible only when the entire pattern was assembled from a distance great enough to see the whole, was a duchy being hollowed from the inside like a tree, consumed by insects that left the bark intact while reducing the heartwood to powder. Caedric set the document down, pressed his palms flat against the desk, closed his eyes. He did not feel anger. Anger required surprise, and he had buried his capacity for surprise along with his father. What he felt was the cold architectural recognition that the most important relationship in his professional life had been a fabrication. 9 years of counsel, 9 years of late-night strategy sessions, and diplomatic negotiations, and the particular intimacy that developed between a ruler and the man he trusted to translate his will into political reality. All of it constructed on foundations that did not exist. The question was not whether Beaumont would be destroyed. That outcome was already inevitable, a calculation completed, a sentence waiting to be pronounced. The question was timing. Arrest Beaumont too early, and the network he controlled would scatter, reform, continue operating from positions Caedric had not yet identified. Arrest him too late, and whatever Beaumont was accelerating toward would arrive before Caedric could build defenses against it. He needed Beaumont to make a move. A visible, documented, undeniable move that would justify public action and strip the conspiracy of the political legitimacy it required to function. He needed bait. Seraphina found him in the war room that evening, staring at the maps with the fixed intensity of a man trying to see through geography into the intentions hiding behind it. She entered without announcing herself, a habit she had developed in the 5 days since the binding that communicated more about the shifting dynamics between them than either was willing to articulate. You met with Beaumont, she said. I did. And? He performed beautifully. Concern, loyalty, measured caution. If I did not have 4 years of financial records proving he has been engineering my destruction, I would have believed every word. Seraphina sat on the edge of the table. It was an informal gesture, the kind of thing she would never have done in the first days of her captivity. The fact that she did it now, in the war room, surrounded by the machinery of Caedric's strategic operations, meant something. He was not yet prepared to determine what. Beaumont requested the defensive assessment, she said. He will use it to identify what you know and what you do not. Every gap in your analysis becomes a corridor he can operate through. Which is why the assessment he receives will contain exactly the gaps I want him to find. Seraphina looked at him. You are feeding him false vulnerabilities. I am creating a controlled environment in which his next move will be the one I designed for him. Caedric walked to the eastern map and placed his finger on the northern border. The garrison at Harrowgate is our weakest defensive position. If Beaumont believes I have failed to reinforce it, he will direct the Crown's military pressure toward that point. When he does, the communication will be documented. The documentation becomes evidence. The evidence becomes justification. And if he does not take the bait, then I arrest him without justification and fight the political consequences. But Beaumont is patient, not cautious. Patient men wait for opportunities, and I am about to give him one he cannot refuse. Seraphina studied the map. Her fingers traced the border with the light touch of a woman reading terrain the way other people read faces. What opportunity? My absence? Caedric stepped back from the map. I will ride to the Eastern Territories tomorrow, a diplomatic tour. 3 days, visible, public. Beaumont will have 72 hours without my presence in the fortress. 72 hours to communicate with his network, accelerate his timeline, and make the move that exposes him. You are leaving Blackthorne. I am leaving the appearance of Blackthorne. Voss and a selected unit will double back after the first day. We will be watching. And if Beaumont's move is not a communication, if it is something more direct. Caedric met her eyes. The question she was actually asking hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. You will be protected, he said. Greaves has instructions. The soldiers assigned to the East Wing answer to Voss directly, not through the normal chain of command. That is not what I asked. It is what I answered. On the morning of the 8th day, Caedric rode east with 40 men. On the evening of the 8th day, Beaumont made his move. It was not the move Caedric expected. At 9:30, while the fortress settled into its nighttime routines and guards changed shifts with the mechanical precision Caedric had drilled into them over years of exacting standards, Chancellor Beaumont walked into the East Wing carrying a bottle of wine and an expression of paternal concern. The soldiers at the corridor's entrance let him pass. Beaumont had clearance to every section of the fortress. He had possessed that clearance for 9 years. Changing it before the trap was sprung would have alerted him. So the soldiers stepped aside, and the Chancellor walked to the Duchess's chambers, and he knocked 3 times with the courteous patience of a man paying a social call. Seraphina opened the door. Chancellor, it is late. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. I wanted to offer congratulations in person and perhaps discuss some matters of household management that might ease your transition. He held up the wine. A Thornfield vintage. From the region of your mother's birth, I thought it appropriate. Seraphina studied the bottle, studied the man. Beaumont's face was composed into the precise arrangement of warmth and deference that had sustained his deception for nearly a decade. It was, she thought, a remarkable performance. The eyes communicated sincerity. The posture communicated respect. The voice communicated the particular quality of trustworthiness that only men who had practiced trustworthiness as a technical skill could produce. Come in, she said. She poured 2 glasses, did not drink. Beaumont sat in the chair by the fireplace with the ease of a man accustomed to being comfortable in rooms that did not belong to him. He sipped his wine and smiled with exactly the right proportion of warmth. The Duke is a formidable man, he began, but formidable men often struggle with the softer requirements of partnership. If there is anything I can do to facilitate understanding between you, I hope you will consider me a resource. That is very kind, Chancellor. Kindness has nothing to do with it. Blackthorne functions best when its leadership is unified. Division at the top creates fractures that enemies exploit. I have watched it happen before. Under the previous Duke. Under several configurations of power. The lesson is always the same. The strongest fortress falls not from external assault, but from internal fracture. Beaumont set his glass down. The firelight caught his face at an angle that stripped the performance for half a second, long enough for Seraphina to see something beneath the composure that was not warmth at all. It was assessment. He was reading her the way a locksmith read a mechanism, searching for the combination that would open her. Your Grace, I must be direct with you. There are elements within the kingdom, powerful elements, that view this marriage as a provocation. Prince Adrian will not accept the loss of his claim quietly. The crown's legal challenge will be aggressive. And within Blackthorne itself, there are those who question whether the Duke's judgment has been compromised. Compromised by what? By attachment. Beaumont leaned forward slightly. You must understand, Caedric Ashcombe has never made a personal decision in his life. Every action, every alliance, every relationship has been governed by strategic calculation. This marriage is the first thing he has done that cannot be explained by pure rationality. And in a court where rationality is the only language spoken, an irrational act makes the speaker appear unstable. Seraphina held her glass without drinking. The wine was dark, almost black in the firelight. What are you suggesting, Chancellor? I'm suggesting that you may find yourself in need of allies who are not bound to the Duke's fortunes. Allies who can provide protection regardless of what happens to Blackthorne. The room went very quiet. The fire crackled, wind pressed against the windows. And Seraphina understood with absolute crystalline clarity that she was being recruited. Beaumont was not here to welcome her. He was here to turn her. Allies like you, she said. Allies like the people I represent. People who have the crown's ear. People who can ensure that regardless of Blackthorne's fate, you emerge intact. And what would these allies require in return? Very little. Access to certain documents the Duke maintains in his war room, copies of correspondence, troop positions. Beaumont smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had found the mechanism's combination. You are a practical woman, Your Grace. You entered Blackthorne as a transaction. I am simply offering you a better one. Seraphina set her glass down. For 5 seconds, she said nothing. The fire burned. Beaumont waited with the patient confidence of a man who had made this pitch before, to other people, in other rooms, and succeeded every time, because he understood that everyone had a price, and finding it was simply a matter of identifying which fear was larger than which loyalty. Thank you for the wine, Chancellor, Seraphina said, and thank you for the clarity. Clarity? You have just told me everything I needed to know about who you are. Beaumont's expression did not change, but something behind it recalculated, a rapid, invisible adjustment that looked like composure but was actually the first stage of contingency activation. He had miscalculated. He saw it now. The mechanism he had been picking was not a lock. It was a trigger. I think you misunderstand me, Your Grace. I think I understand you perfectly, Chancellor Beaumont. Seraphina stood. You entered my chambers to offer me a betrayal dressed as protection. You assumed that because I came to Blackthorne through calculation, I could be purchased through a better one. You assumed that because the Duke acquired me as a strategic asset, I could be reacquired by a higher bidder. Your Grace, assure you, what you did not calculate is that I have spent my entire life being underestimated by men who confuse compliance with weakness. I complied with your conversation. I let you speak. I let you expose yourself in a room where every word has been heard by the guards stationed behind the service panel to your left. Beaumont turned. The panel was open. Captain Voss stood behind it, flanked by 2 soldiers, a written transcript in his hand and an expression on his face that communicated nothing except professional readiness. Beaumont looked back at Seraphina. For the first time in 9 years of flawless performance, the mask fractured, not dramatically. Beaumont was too controlled for theater. But the fracture was there, visible in the slight dilation of his pupils and the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The look of a man who had just realized that the trap he walked into had been designed by someone operating at his own level. The Duke will hear about this, Beaumont said softly. The Duke designed it, Seraphina replied. Beaumont was taken that night. Not arrested, taken. The distinction mattered. Arrests were public, governed by protocol, subject to legal challenge. What happened to Beaumont happened in silence, between stone walls, conducted by men whose names would never appear in any record. Voss's soldiers escorted the Chancellor to the lower levels of the fortress with professional efficiency and absolute discretion. By morning, his chambers had been sealed, his documents confiscated, and his staff reassigned to positions where their access to information was precisely zero. Caedric returned to Blackthorne at dawn on the 9th day. He had ridden through the night. His horse was lathered. His face carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had not slept but would not allow fatigue to register as anything except fuel. He found Seraphina in the war room. She was sitting at the table surrounded by Beaumont's confiscated documents, cross-referencing names with a focus so intense she did not hear him enter. It is done, she said without looking up. Voss has him in the lower chambers. The transcript of his recruitment attempt is complete. 3 witnesses, documented chain of custody. Caedric walked to the table, looked at the documents, looked at her. "You did well," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hands were steady. "I did what was necessary." "That is the same thing." The moment held, not warmth, not intimacy, but something adjacent, recognition, the particular quality of acknowledgement that passed between two people who operated at velocities that left most others behind and had found, in each other, a pace they did not need to slow for. Then Greaves appeared in the doorway. His face was wrong. In 40 years of service, Greaves had maintained the same expression through assassinations, political crises, and the death of Caedric's father. It was an expression designed to communicate that whatever had happened, it was being managed. The expression he wore now communicated the opposite. "Your Grace." His voice was thin, controlled, but thin. "A force has been sighted crossing the southern ridge. Banners of the Crown, approximately 300 cavalry and 200 infantry." Caedric's body went still. Not tense. Still. The kind of stillness that preceded the moment when every calculation running in his mind arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. 300 cavalry, he repeated. Prince Adrian Valemont leads them personally. He carries a writ of reclamation, a direct order from the crown to recover Lady Seraphina Vale by force if diplomatic means have been exhausted. Seraphina Vale no longer exists. The Duchess of Blackthorne does. The crown does not recognize the binding, Your Grace. Their position is that the territorial protection invocation was fraudulent and the marriage therefore void. Caedric turned to the map. 500 soldiers, approaching from the south. Blackthorne's garrison numbered 320, reinforced by perhaps 60 territorial militia who could be mobilized within hours. The mathematics were survivable but brutal, and they assumed no additional forces arriving from the west, where Ashford's territories bordered Blackthorne's most vulnerable flank. "How long?" he said. "At their current pace, they reach our outer boundaries by tomorrow evening." Caedric placed both hands on the table, leaned forward. The map spread beneath him like a landscape of options, narrowing to a corridor, narrowing to a doorway, narrowing to a single impossible point where every path forward required something he had spent his entire life refusing to provide: trust. He could not defend Blackthorne alone. The numbers did not permit it. He needed the eastern lords, Harwick, Drummond, Castellan, houses that had maintained cautious neutrality because they feared him enough to avoid opposition but did not trust him enough to offer support. He needed them now, within hours. And convincing 3 independent lords to march their soldiers toward a fortress surrounded by the crown's military required something no amount of fear or strategic calculation could manufacture. It required them to believe that Caedric Ashcombe was worth fighting for, not because he was powerful, not because defying him was dangerous, but because the man behind the power was someone whose cause justified the risk of destruction. And Caedric, standing in the war room of a fortress he had governed through control and isolation and the systematic elimination of every human connection that might compromise his judgment, understood with devastating clarity that he had spent 32 years building a world in which no one had reason to fight for him. Fear kept men obedient. It did not make them brave. He looked at Seraphina. She was watching him with the expression of a woman who saw exactly what he saw. The architecture of his own isolation collapsing around him at the precise moment when its cost became unsurvivable. "You need allies," she said quietly. "Real ones. Not subordinates. Not assets. People who choose your side because they believe in what you are building, not because they are afraid of what you will do if they refuse." "I do not know how to ask for that." The admission left his mouth before he could intercept it. 5 words. Quiet. Raw. Stripped of every defense mechanism he possessed. And the vulnerability of it, the sheer, unarmored exposure of a man admitting a deficiency he had never once acknowledged, hung in the war room like a wound opened in daylight. Seraphina stood, walked to him, stood close enough that the space between them held nothing except the truth of what they were facing. "Then let me show you." Outside the fortress, the southern horizon darkened with the dust of 500 soldiers marching toward Blackthorne. Inside, a man who had ruled through fear his entire life stood at the threshold of a transformation he could not calculate, could not control, and could not survive without. And the woman beside him, the woman he had imprisoned, married, and still could not predict, was the only person in the kingdom willing to teach a ruthless duke the one thing his ruthlessness had never been able to provide: how to be worth following. Seraphina rode out at first light, not with an escort of soldiers, not with Blackthorne banners or diplomatic seals or any of the instruments of authority that Caedric would have deployed to communicate power. She rode with greaves, 2 horses, and a leather satchel containing 3 letters she had written between midnight and dawn while Caedric stood at the war room table, redrawing defensive positions for a siege he could not win with the men he had. She did not ask his permission. She told him what she was doing and the distinction, the sheer, deliberate inversion of every dynamic that had governed their relationship since the moment she walked into his fortress, landed in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. "Harwick first," she said, pulling on riding gloves in the courtyard while grooms brought the horses. "He is the closest and the most pragmatic. If Harwick commits, Drummond will follow, because Drummond has never made an independent decision in his life. Castellan is the difficult one. He despises you personally. Castellan despises everyone personally. It is his only consistent quality. Then I will not appeal to his affection. I will appeal to his survival." Seraphina mounted. The horse shifted beneath her, and she steadied it with her knees, her hands, the particular authority of a woman who had learned to ride not for leisure, but because the distance between safety and destruction was often measured in how fast you could cover ground. "You have 12 hours, Caedric. Use them." It was the first time she had used his name. He heard it land, felt the weight of it settle somewhere behind his sternum, where he kept things he did not examine. He said nothing. She rode through the gates into gray morning light, and he watched her until the road swallowed her, and then he turned back to a fortress that suddenly felt emptier than 320 soldiers should have allowed. 12 hours. Caedric used every one. He began with Voss. The captain met him in the armory at dawn, already in field gear, his face carrying the grim efficiency of a professional soldier who understood that the mathematics of their situation were terrible and intended to fight anyway because mathematics had never been the only variable in warfare. "The southern approach is indefensible with our current numbers," Voss said, spreading a terrain map across the anvil because every table in the war room was already covered. "Adrian's cavalry will reach the river crossing by tomorrow afternoon. If he pushes through without resting, he hits our outer walls by nightfall." "He will not push through." Caedric studied the terrain with the intensity of a man reading his own survival in the contour lines. "Adrian is theatrical. He wants an audience, not a battle. He will make camp at the river, send a diplomatic envoy demanding Seraphina's surrender, and give us until morning to comply. When we refuse, he attacks at dawn with the full moral authority of a prince who tried diplomacy first." "Then we have until dawn the day after tomorrow." "We have until dawn the day after tomorrow." Voss looked at the map, looked at his duke. "What are your orders?" Caedric placed his finger on a narrow passage between the southern ridge and the castle's outer fortifications, a corridor of land barely wide enough for 30 men abreast, flanked on both sides by steep embankments thick with old-growth forest. "We do not fight them on open ground. We cannot. But this passage is the only viable approach for cavalry. If Adrian commits his horsemen through here, they become a column instead of a line. A column can be broken." "With what?" "We do not have enough men to hold both the passage and the walls." "We hold the passage. The walls hold themselves." Voss stared at him. "You are proposing to abandon the fortress and fight in the field." "I am proposing that a fortress without enough defenders is a tomb. We meet them in terrain that neutralizes their numerical advantage, and we hit them before they can deploy into formation." "That is insane, Your Grace." Every strategist who ever survived a war they should have lost was called insane by someone who preferred dying sensibly. "Prepare the men." Voss opened his mouth, closed it. He had served Caedric for 7 years and had disagreed with him on 11 occasions. He had been wrong 8 of those times. The other 3, Caedric had been wrong but had adapted so quickly that the outcome was indistinguishable from having been right. "Yes, Your Grace." The hours that followed were the quietest Caedric had ever experienced inside Blackthorne Keep. Not silent. Silence implied absence. This was something different. The fortress hummed with a low, contained frequency of preparation. Soldiers checked weapons without speaking. Stable hands readied horses with precise mechanical efficiency. Kitchen staff packed field rations into saddlebags. The entire machinery of Blackthorne shifted from governance to survival with the grim fluidity of an organism that understood, at some cellular level, that the next 24 hours would determine whether it continued to exist. Caedric moved through it all with the focused calm of a man operating past the threshold of fear into the territory beyond it. The cold, crystalline landscape where every decision became pure function because the emotional architecture that normally complicated decision-making had been temporarily stripped away by the proximity of annihilation. He found himself in the East Wing at midday. He had not intended to go there. His feet carried him through corridors he had walked 10,000 times, past doors he had opened and closed without thought, and deposited him in the chambers where Seraphina had slept for 11 nights. The rooms smelled faintly of her, ink, the particular soap the castle stores provided, and something beneath both that was warm and human and impossible to classify with the analytical framework he applied to everything else in his life. Her writing desk was organized with military precision, papers stacked by category, quills cleaned and arranged by size. A half-finished letter to someone whose name she had scratched out sat beneath a paperweight carved from black stone. He picked up the paperweight, turned it in his hands. Standing in an empty room that belonged to a woman who had ridden toward danger on his behalf while he prepared to fight a war he had no guarantee of winning, Caedric Ashcombe experienced something he could not strategize around, could not control, and could not eliminate through the application of superior force. He was afraid for someone other than himself. The realization did not arrive like a revelation. It arrived like a wound, sudden, specific, located in a place he had assumed was armored. He was afraid that Seraphina would not return. He was afraid that the Eastern Lords would refuse her, and she would ride back to a fortress under siege with no allies and no options. He was afraid that the woman who had walked into his catacombs without flinching and proposed marriage as a tactical maneuver, and called him by his name for the first time this morning in a courtyard that smelled of horses and rain, would be consumed by the same machinery of aristocratic violence that had consumed his father, his mother, and every person he had ever been foolish enough to care about. He set the paperweight down, picked up the half-finished letter, read it. It was addressed to no one. It was addressed to him. 3 lines, written in the controlled hand of a woman who chose every word the way a surgeon chose incisions. I did not come to Blackthorne to be saved. I came because I recognized in you the same wound I carry. The absolute certainty that needing another person is the most direct path to destruction. We are both right, and we are both already destroyed. Caedric folded the letter, put it in his coat, left the room. The diplomatic envoy arrived at 4 in the afternoon. 2 riders carrying the crown's banner approached Blackthorne's outer gates under a flag of truce. Caedric received them in the main courtyard, standing in full armor with Voss at his right shoulder and 200 soldiers arranged in formation behind him. Not because he needed the display for 2 messengers, but because the messengers would report everything they saw, and what they saw needed to communicate a fortress prepared for war rather than negotiation. The senior envoy dismounted. He was young, well-bred, visibly uncomfortable, a minor nobleman's son chosen for the assignment because his expendability was proportional to his ambition. He carried a scroll sealed with Adrian's personal crest. Duke Ashcombe. His Royal Highness Prince Adrian Valamont extends his respects and his demand. Lady Seraphina Vale is to be remanded to Crown custody by dawn tomorrow. The territorial protection invocation has been adjudicated and rejected. The binding ceremony is deemed void by royal decree. Compliance will be met with the Crown's continued goodwill. Refusal will be met with force. Caedric took the scroll, did not open it, held it the way a man held something he intended to burn. Tell Prince Adrian 3 things. His voice carried across the courtyard with the flat, resonant authority of a man who had been giving orders in this space since before the envoy was born. First, Lady Seraphina Vale does not exist. The Duchess of Blackthorne does. His decree has no authority over my wife any more than it has authority over the walls of this fortress or the ground beneath his feet. Second, The territorial protection invocation was filed under statutes that predate Adrian's authority by 2 centuries. If he wishes to challenge them, he can do so through legitimate adjudication, not through cavalry columns. Third, he broke the seal, unrolled the scroll, read it in 2 seconds, tore it in half, let the pieces fall to the cobblestones. Blackthorne does not comply. The envoy's face went white, not from the words. He had probably expected them, from the way they were delivered, without anger, without negotiation, without any of the diplomatic scaffolding that normally surrounded a refusal, allowing both parties to pretend that accommodation was still possible. Caedric had stripped the interaction to its bare mechanical components, a demand, a refusal, and the violence that would follow both. The envoy mounted his horse, rode south, and the clock started. Seraphina returned at sundown. She rode through the gates with Greaves beside her, both horses blowing hard, her face streaked with road dust and something that looked less like exhaustion and more like the particular energy of a woman who had accomplished something through sheer force of will and was already calculating what came next. "Harwick commits 200 men," she said, dismounting before the horse fully stopped. "They march through the night. Drummond follows with 150. They arrive by morning." "Castellan." Seraphina pulled off her gloves. Her hands were raw from the reins. Castellan required persuasion. "What kind of persuasion?" "I told him the truth, every piece of it. Beaumont's conspiracy, the Crown's overreach, the financial networks, the compromised intelligence. I laid the entire architecture of what has been done to Blackthorne on his table and let him see it for what it was. Not an attack on one duke, but a template. A method that the Crown could replicate against any lord, any territory, any house that became too powerful or too independent to control. And that was enough. That and one other thing." Seraphina met his eyes. "I told him you were afraid." The courtyard went quiet. Soldiers who had been organizing equipment stopped. Voss turned from his position by the gate. Even the horses seemed to register the shift in atmospheric pressure. "You told a rival lord that I was afraid." "I told him that the most powerful man in the north had looked at his situation, assessed his resources, and admitted, for the first time in his life, that he could not do this alone. I told him that a duke who had spent 32 years building walls had finally understood that walls without people behind them are just stone. And I told him that if he wanted proof that Blackthorne had changed, the proof was standing in front of him. A woman the duke had imprisoned, married, and then trusted with his survival." "How did Castellan respond?" "He stared at me for a very long time. Then he said, 'The bastard must actually love you.' And he committed 300 men. The number hung in the air, 300, plus Harwick's 200, plus Drummond's 150, plus Blackthorne's 320, 970 men against Adrian's 500. The mathematics had changed. Caedric looked at Seraphina in the fading light of a courtyard that had watched 7 generations of Ashcombes prepare for war. She stood in road dust and sweat and the borrowed authority of a duchess who had held the title for 11 days and had just single-handedly assembled a coalition that Caedric's entire career of fear-based governance had failed to produce. He wanted to say something. The impulse was there, raw, inarticulate, pressing against the interior walls of a man who had spent decades ensuring those walls were impenetrable. But the words did not exist in his vocabulary. He had never learned the language for what he was feeling because he had never needed it, and now, standing in the shadow of a battle that would determine whether his house survived the night, he understood that the absence was not strength. It was the most expensive thing his isolation had cost him. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, quiet, stripped of performance, offered with the unvarnished simplicity of a man who did not know how to say what he meant and chose accuracy over elegance. Seraphina looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, recognition, exhaustion, the ghost of an emotion she had been refusing to name since the night she proposed an alliance with a man she should have feared and discovered in the architecture of his ruthlessness, a loneliness that mirrored her own so precisely it terrified her. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Win first." They moved through the night like a machine assembling itself in darkness. Caedric positioned his forces in the southern passage at midnight. 200 Blackthorne soldiers dug into the embankments on either side. concealed by forest and darkness and the absolute discipline of men who understood that sound was death and silence was survival. The remaining 120 held the fortress walls under Greaves's command, visible enough from the south to suggest that Blackthorne was defending conventionally. Harwick's men arrived at 3 in the morning. 200 soldiers, road-weary but functional, led by Harwick's eldest son, a 24-year-old with his father's jaw and his mother's intelligence, who saluted Caedric with the crisp deference of a man who had been raised on stories of the Ashcombe Duke and was now standing close enough to understand why those stories never included the word merciful. Drummond's 150 followed an hour later. Castellan's 300 arrived at 4:30, led by Castellan himself, a massive, gray-bearded lord who rode directly to Caedric and looked down at him from horseback with an expression that mixed skepticism, grudging respect, and the particular intensity of a man who had committed his soldiers based on a woman's testimony and was now determining whether the man she described actually existed. Ashcombe. Castellan. Your wife told me you have changed. My wife told you what she believed would bring you here. Whether I have changed is something you will determine for yourself over the next 6 hours. Castellan grunted. It was from him practically an embrace. He dismounted and walked to the terrain map Voss had staked into the ground. Show me where you want my men. Dawn came the color of iron. Adrian's forces broke camp at first light and moved toward Blackthorne in formation. Cavalry forward, infantry following, banners catching the thin morning sun. From the ridge above the southern passage, Caedric watched them through a field scope with the patient attention of a man observing an equation resolving toward a solution he had already calculated. Adrian rode at the center of his cavalry. Even at distance, his armor was unmistakable, polished silver, ornamental, designed for appearance rather than function. He sat his horse the way a man sat a horse when he wanted to be painted doing it. Behind him, 300 cavalry moved in disciplined formation, lances upright, the drumming of hooves on packed earth building into a rhythm that carried across the valley like a heartbeat amplifying. They entered the passage at 6:30. Caedric let the vanguard pass, let the first 100 riders clear the narrows and spread into the approach field before the fortress walls. Let Adrian himself ride deep enough into the corridor that retreat became a logistical nightmare rather than a tactical option. Then he gave the signal. The embankments erupted. Castellan's men hit the cavalry column from the western tree line with a violence that turned the passage into a corridor of chaos in under 30 seconds. Horses screamed, riders went down. Lances shattered against tree trunks as cavalry tried to wheel in space too narrow for formation maneuvers. From the eastern embankment, Harwick's archers put arrows into the column's center with the disciplined precision of men who had been told exactly where to aim and understood that accuracy mattered more than volume. Caedric led Blackthorne's 200 directly into the column's throat. He fought the way he governed, without hesitation, without performance, without any gesture wasted on theater when function demanded economy. His sword took the first rider through the gap between breastplate and shoulder guard. The second he unhorsed with a shield strike that sent the man into the mud beneath hooves that did not discriminate between loyalty and treachery. The third drew a blade and swung, and Caedric felt the impact rattle through his arm guard and responded with a counterstrike so fast the man was on the ground before his brain registered that his weapon was no longer in his hand. Around him, the passage dissolved into the controlled havoc of a battle fought in space too small for strategy and too brutal for anything except instinct, training, and the willingness to absorb damage and keep moving. Voss fought at Caedric's right. Castellan's men pressed the western flank with the relentless momentum of soldiers who had been promised a fight and intended to finish it. Drummond's forces held the northern exit, preventing Adrian's infantry from reinforcing the cavalry trapped in the narrows. The mathematics of violence worked exactly as Caedric had calculated. Adrian's cavalry, superior in number, training, and equipment, became liabilities in confined terrain. Horses collided, formations collapsed. The precision that made cavalry devastating in open battle became chaos when the open battle was removed. 40 minutes. That was how long it took. 40 minutes of steel and screaming and mud churned red and the particular sound that armor made when it failed. A crunch that was half metallic and half organic. and that stayed in the memory of every man who heard it long after the battle ended. Adrian's cavalry broke. Not gradually, not through the slow erosion of morale that characterized most military defeats. They broke the way a structure broke when the load exceeded its tolerance. Suddenly, completely, with men throwing down weapons and turning horses toward the rear, and the entire formation collapsing inward like a building whose foundations had been pulled out from beneath it. And at the center of the collapse, surrounded by fallen riders and broken lances and the wreckage of a military operation that had been designed to demonstrate the crown's dominance and had instead demonstrated its limitations, Prince Adrian Valamont sat his silver-armored horse and stared at the carnage with the expression of a man who had spent his entire life believing that rank was the same thing as capability and was discovering, in the mud and blood of a passage he should never have entered, that it was not. Caedric rode toward him. The distance between them closed in the particular silence that followed violence, the ringing, pressurized quiet that filled the spaces where screaming had been, when the survivors were still processing that they had survived and the dying were still processing that they had not. Caedric stopped 10 feet from the prince. His armor was dented, streaked with blood that was not entirely his own. His horse was bleeding from a cut across the shoulder. His breathing was controlled but heavy, the measured intake of a man managing pain he would not acknowledge because acknowledgement required attention, and attention was a resource allocated entirely to the man in front of him. "Adrian?" The prince's face was pale. Sweat and grime streaked across features that had been designed for portraits and diplomacy, and the particular kind of aristocratic beauty that crumbled the instant it made contact with the raw mechanics of consequence. "You are making a mistake, Ashcombe." Adrian's voice shook. He was trying to command. It came out closer to pleading. "The crown will not forgive this. You have attacked a royal force. You have committed treason." "I have defended my territory against an armed invasion conducted without legal authority. The distinction will matter when the historians write about this." "Historians?" Adrian's laugh was sharp, brittle, the sound of a man reaching for contempt and finding only fear. "You think you will survive long enough for historians. I think you should look behind you, Adrian." The prince turned. Behind his shattered cavalry column, blocking the southern exit of the passage, Castellan's reserve force had closed the corridor. 300 men, fresh, armed, positioned with the professional precision of soldiers who had not yet fought and were prepared to if the prince made the mistake of believing this was a negotiation rather than a conclusion. Adrian looked at the blockade, looked at his ruined cavalry, looked at Caedric, and for the first time in his royal life, Prince Adrian Valamont understood what it felt like to have no move left. "Surrender your force," Caedric said. "Formally, publicly, before your own men and mine. Withdraw from Blackthorne territory and carry word to the crown that the Duchess of Blackthorne is not a commodity to be claimed, and this duchy is not a province to be absorbed. And if I refuse, then the passage closes, your men die in the mud, and the crown loses a prince." Caedric's voice carried no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction, only the flat mechanical delivery of a man presenting terms he had calculated to the decimal. "You have 30 seconds. Adrian's hand moved to his sword. Stopped. His fingers trembled on the pommel. The tremor of a body caught between the impulse to fight and the recognition that fighting was no longer a viable option, but surrendering required a kind of courage he had never been trained to possess. 20 seconds. 15. 10. Adrian pulled his sword from its sheath. The blade caught the morning light, clean, unused, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the mud and blood and devastation surrounding it with grotesque clarity. He reversed it, held it out hilt first toward Caedric. The passage went silent. 500 men on both sides watched a prince of the crown offer his sword to a duke who had just dismantled his army in 40 minutes. Caedric took the blade. And in that moment, hands gripping a surrendered weapon while his body ached and his horse bled, and the passage reeked of iron and sweat and the particular stench of violence that no amount of heroic narrative would ever sanitize, Caedric Ashcombe understood something that 32 years of isolation and control and the systematic elimination of vulnerability had prevented him from seeing. He had not won because he was ruthless. He had won because 970 men had chosen to stand beside him. Harwick, Drummond, Castellan, Men who owed him nothing except the truth a woman had carried to their doors on horseback through the night. Men who had looked at the architecture of his isolation and decided, based on the testimony of a duchess he had imprisoned and married and trusted with his survival, that the man behind the walls was worth saving. Ruthlessness had kept him alive. But it was not ruthlessness standing in this passage. It was something he did not yet have a word for. Something that had begun the night a woman in silver silk walked into his catacombs and refused to look away. Something that had grown through 11 days of shared war rooms and midnight strategy, and a letter he carried folded against his chest that said, "We are both already destroyed." Something that terrified him far more than any army. A sound shattered the silence. From the direction of Blackthorne Keep, behind him, north, where the fortress stood defended by a skeleton garrison under Greaves's command, a column of black smoke rose against the iron sky. Caedric spun in his saddle. The smoke was thick, dark, climbing from the eastern wing of the castle in a pillar that bent against the wind like a living thing. Even at this distance, the orange flicker of active flame was visible through the windows where Seraphina's chambers had been. Voss reached him first. "Your Grace, rider from the fortress, Greaves reports." He stopped. His face told the rest before his mouth caught up. "What?" "Fire in the east wing, origin unknown, and the Duchess—" Voss swallowed. "The Duchess is unaccounted for." Caedric's hands tightened on the reins until the leather cut into his palms. The surrendered sword in his grip suddenly weighed nothing compared to the pressure building behind his ribs, a force he could not calculate, could not control, could not strategize around because it was not tactical and it was not rational, and it came from the part of himself he had spent 3 decades sealing behind walls that were now, in the span of a single sentence, crumbling. He turned his horse north and rode toward the fire. Caedric rode like a man who had forgotten that horses had limits. The distance between the southern passage and Blackthorne Keep was 4 miles. He covered it in under 9 minutes, driving his wounded horse across terrain that should have demanded caution, through mud that should have demanded patience, past the outer fortifications where skeleton garrison soldiers shouted reports he did not hear, because the only information that mattered was the black smoke climbing from the eastern wing of his fortress and the single sentence repeating in his skull with the relentless rhythm of a heartbeat stripped of everything except emergency. She is unaccounted for. The courtyard was chaos when he arrived. Soldiers hauled water from the well in leather buckets that accomplished nothing against flames already climbing the interior walls of the east wing. Servants ran through smoke carrying salvaged furniture, documents, tapestries. The reflexive human impulse to save objects when the thing worth saving was not an object at all. Greaves stood at the eastern entrance, coordinating efforts with the methodical composure of a man managing a disaster he could not control, his voice hoarse from shouting, his face blackened with soot. Caedric dismounted before the horse stopped. His boots hit cobblestone and he was moving, armor and all, toward the eastern wing with the particular velocity of a man who had stopped calculating outcomes and started operating on something far more primitive than strategy. Greaves intercepted him. The old steward stepped directly into his path with a courage that would have been suicidal under any other circumstances. "Your Grace, the east wing is fully involved. The upper floors are compromised. You cannot—" "Where is she?" "We do not know. She was seen entering the east wing 20 minutes before the fire. She has not been seen since." Caedric looked at the burning wing. Flames poured from the second-floor windows with the lazy, confident violence of a fire that had already won and was simply consuming its victory. The stone walls would survive. Stone always survived. But everything inside those walls, wood, fabric, paper, flesh, was fuel, and fire did not negotiate with fuel. Who started it? Greaves hesitated. The hesitation lasted half a second, but Caedric read it the way he read every hesitation, as a container for information someone was deciding whether to deliver. "Speak." Beaumont's men. 3 soldiers from the lower garrison who remained loyal to the Chancellor. They overpowered their guards during the battle and set fire to the East Wing stores. 2 have been captured. The third— Greaves stopped. The third was seen entering the Duchess's chambers before the fire spread to the upper floors. Caedric did not respond. He walked past Greaves, through the eastern entrance, into the corridor that connected the main fortress to the burning wing. Smoke rolled along the ceiling in thick, churning waves that dropped lower with every step. The heat hit him at the first turning, not gradual, not incremental, but sudden and total, like walking into a wall constructed from temperature rather than stone. He kept moving. Behind him, Voss's voice cut through the smoke. The captain had followed from the passage on a fresh horse, arriving minutes after Caedric, and was now running through the corridor in full armor with the grim determination of a man who understood that his duke was about to do something catastrophically inadvisable and intended to be present for the consequences. "Your Grace! Caedric, stop!" Caedric did not stop. The corridor ahead was orange, flickering, alive with the particular light that fire produced when it had fully committed to destruction. The air tasted of char and something chemical, accelerant, he realized. The fire had been set with purpose. Not an accident, not spontaneous, engineered. The way everything in his life was engineered. The way every threat arrived, disguised as something manageable, and revealed itself as something existential, only after it was too late for manageable responses. He reached the staircase to the upper floor. The steps were stone, but the railing was wood, and the wood was burning, and the heat coming from above was the kind that meant the rooms beyond had crossed from fire into furnace. He climbed. The smoke at the top was dense enough to make breathing an act of will rather than reflex. Caedric pulled the collar of his coat over his mouth and nose, an inadequate measure that bought minutes he might not have, and moved through the upper corridor by memory and touch, his gauntleted hand trailing along the wall because visibility had dropped to nothing and the geometry of his own fortress had become hostile territory. Seraphina's chamber was the fourth door on the left. He found it by counting. The door was hot. The iron handle burned through his glove when he gripped it. He threw his shoulder against the wood and it gave, not because he was strong, though he was, but because the fire had already weakened the frame from the inside, and the door collapsed inward like a structure surrendering to forces it could no longer resist. The room was burning, curtains, bedding, the writing desk where Seraphina had organized papers with military precision, the chair by the fireplace where Beaumont had sat and smiled and offered treason with the polished sincerity of a man who understood that the most effective weapons were the ones your enemy invited into the room. And on the floor, near the window, two figures. Seraphina was on her knees. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Soot covered her face, her arms, her hands. Blood ran from a cut above her left eye. The eye was swollen, already darkening, and the angle of the wound suggested a fist rather than a blade. She was breathing, alive, conscious. Her eyes locked onto Caedric through the smoke with the particular intensity of a woman who had been waiting for something she refused to admit she expected. Beneath her, face down on the stone floor with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that bones were not designed to accommodate, was Beaumont's man. A soldier, young, built for violence, currently experiencing the consequences of underestimating a woman who had survived worse men than him in worse rooms than this. A fire iron lay on the floor beside them. The end was wet with blood. Seraphina had fought him, alone, in a burning room, with a fire iron. "You took your time," she said. Her voice was raw from smoke. The words came out scraped, hoarse, barely above a whisper. But the tone, the absolute irreducible refusal to sound like a woman who had been rescued, was intact. Caedric crossed the room in 3 steps. He pulled the soldier off the floor by his collar, threw him toward the doorway where Voss had appeared through the smoke, and turned back to Seraphina. "Can you walk?" "I have been walking since before you decided to care whether I could." He almost laughed. The impulse rose from somewhere so deep inside him that it bypassed every defense mechanism, every wall, every carefully maintained architecture of emotional suppression, and arrived at the surface as a sound that was half breath, half something he did not recognize because he had not made it in so long that the muscles required had atrophied. He took her arm. She let him. And in the act of letting him, in the voluntary surrender of independence by a woman who had survived a burning room through her own violence and her own will and owed him nothing except the courtesy of accepting help she did not need, something between them shifted with the permanence of tectonic plates reaching a new configuration. They descended through smoke, through heat, through a corridor that was collapsing in stages, ceiling beams groaning and dropping sparks like warnings from a structure announcing its own death. Voss led with the captured soldier. Caedric followed with Seraphina's weight against his side. She was injured more than she admitted, favoring her left leg, breathing in shallow, controlled bursts that told him at least 2 ribs were damaged. And the 4 of them emerged into the courtyard air like survivors crawling from wreckage that had tried its best to kill them and failed. Greaves was there with water, a physician, blankets that smelled like horse and wool, and the particular mundane comfort of objects that had no strategic value and existed only to make damaged people less damaged. Seraphina sat on the courtyard steps. The physician examined her ribs. She endured it with the flat tolerance of a woman who considered medical attention a logistical requirement rather than a comfort. Caedric stood 3 feet away, close enough to see her breathe, far enough to maintain the fiction that his proximity was tactical rather than personal. His armor was scorched. His lungs burned with every inhale. The cut on his forearm from the battle, which he had not noticed during the fight, and had ignored during the ride, and had forgotten entirely during the fire, was now making itself known with the insistent ache of a wound that would require stitching and would not receive it until everything else was handled. He did not move. He stood in the courtyard of a fortress half on fire, watching a woman hold still while a physician wrapped her ribs, and he felt the full weight of what the last 12 days had cost him settle into his body like sediment reaching the bottom of a river that had been turbulent for so long it had forgotten what stillness felt like. The cost was not political. He could rebuild alliances, restructure intelligence networks, fortify borders, negotiate with the crown from a position of demonstrated strength. The political damage was significant but survivable. He had survived worse. The cost was internal. 12 days ago, Caedric Ashcombe had understood himself completely. He was control. He was isolation. He was the principle that needing another person was the most direct path to destruction. And he had enforced that principle with the absolute consistency of a man who could not afford to test whether the principle was wrong, because the test itself would be fatal. Now the principle was ash, not disproven by argument, not undermined by philosophy, demolished by the simple, brutal, empirically verifiable fact that when he heard the words "the Duchess is unaccounted for," every strategic calculation in his mind had stopped. Every defensive priority had been abandoned. Every principle governing his behavior since his father bled out on white linen had been suspended without hesitation, without deliberation, without even the pretense of rational assessment, in favor of a single imperative that operated beneath thought, beneath training, beneath everything he had constructed to protect himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. Find her. That was all. Find her. 2 words that bypassed 32 years of carefully engineered emotional architecture and reduced the most disciplined mind in the kingdom to a single, ungovernable, terrifying need. He had ridden into a burning building for a woman he had known for 12 days, and he would do it again. The fire in the East Wing burned for 3 more hours before the combined efforts of garrison soldiers and Castellan's men brought it under control. The wing was gutted, 4 rooms destroyed entirely. The structural walls survived because Ashcombe ancestors had built them from stone quarried in the northern mountains, dense enough to resist heat that consumed everything else. It was, Caedric reflected, a fitting metaphor for the house itself. The structure endured, but everything inside it that had once been familiar was gone, and what replaced it would have to be built deliberately rather than inherited. Beaumont's captured loyalists were interrogated by Voss personally. The fire had been a contingency. Beaumont's final instruction to men who had been embedded in the lower garrison for years, activated only if the Chancellor was taken. The objective was not military. It was personal. Kill the Duchess. Remove the catalyst that had destabilized Beaumont's control. The assumption was that without Seraphina, Caedric would revert to the isolated, predictable, manipulable ruler Beaumont had spent 9 years managing. The assumption was wrong, but it revealed something about Beaumont's understanding of Caedric that was, in its way, more devastating than the betrayal itself. Beaumont had believed, genuinely, completely, with the confidence of a man who had studied his target for nearly a decade, that Caedric's attachment to Seraphina was a temporary aberration. A tactical error, a weakness that would correct itself once the emotional variable was removed. He had not understood that the weakness was the first real thing Caedric had allowed himself to feel since his father died. Beaumont was brought before Caedric on the morning of the second day after the battle. The Chancellor looked diminished, not broken. Beaumont was too architecturally sound for breaking, but reduced, the way a building looked reduced after its facade was stripped away, and the structural deficiencies behind it became visible. He stood in the main hall with his hands bound, flanked by Voss's soldiers, facing the man he had betrayed with the composed resignation of a professional who understood that his performance had ended, and the only remaining question was the nature of the curtain call. The hall was full. Castellan stood against the eastern wall with his arms crossed. Harwick's son occupied a position near the door. Drummond sat in a chair because Drummond always sat when chairs were available. Blackthorne soldiers lined the perimeter. Greaves stood at Caedric's left shoulder. Seraphina stood at his right. Caedric looked at Beaumont for a long time before speaking. 12 seconds. Long enough for the silence to become a presence in the room, a weight that pressed against everyone's chest and made the act of breathing feel like something that required permission. 9 years, Caedric said. His voice was quiet. Not the killing quiet Greaves feared. Something different. Something that sounded like a man examining wreckage and trying to determine which pieces were real and which had been fabrication. 9 years you sat in this hall and told me what I needed to hear. 9 years you managed my diplomacy, shaped my alliances, and positioned yourself as the one thing I was foolish enough to believe I had. And what was that? Beaumont said. Someone who stayed because they chose to. The words landed in the hall like a blade finding bone. Castellan shifted against the wall. Harwick's son looked at the floor. Even Voss, professional, unflappable, constructed from the same unbreakable material as the fortress itself, looked away. Beaumont's expression did not change, but something moved behind it. A flicker, barely visible, the ghost of something that might have been regret, or might have been the final tactical assessment of a man determining whether regret could be leveraged. You made it easy, Caedric. Beaumont used his first name. It was the first time in 9 years. You wanted to believe that control was sufficient, that fear replaced connection, that if you built the walls high enough and the rules tight enough, you would never need to trust anyone the way your father trusted the man who killed him. I did not create your isolation. I simply made it comfortable and profitable. Every relationship is transactional. You taught me that. The difference between us is that I was honest about the currency. The difference between us is that you are standing in chains and I am not. Caedric stepped forward. One step. The distance between them closed to something personal, something that transformed a public tribunal into a private reckoning. You will be transported to the capital under guard. You will stand before whatever court the crown assembles, and you will answer for what you built inside my house. The crown will not prosecute me. I was serving their interests. The crown will prosecute you because the alternative is admitting they sanctioned a conspiracy against a sovereign duchy. They will sacrifice you to maintain the fiction that the system works. Caedric paused. You taught me that too. Beaumont looked at him, then at Seraphina, then back at Caedric with an expression that finally, for the first time since his capture, showed something unmanufactured. She will destroy you, he said quietly, not through betrayal, through something worse. She will make you need her, and needing someone is the one vulnerability you cannot armor against. I know, Caedric said. 2 words. No defense, no deflection, just the raw, unvarnished admission of a man who had spent 12 days discovering that the vulnerability Beaumont described was not a flaw in his design, but the correction of one. Beaumont was removed from the hall. The days that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a world rearranging itself after violence. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the deliberate pace of reconstruction, where every action was both practical and symbolic. And the line between rebuilding a fortress and rebuilding the people inside it blurred until the distinction ceased to matter. Castellan departed on the 3rd day. He clasped Caedric's arm in the courtyard with the grip of a man who had decided, through the empirical evidence of shared combat and the testimony of a woman he respected, that the Duke of Blackthorne was worth the investment of trust. Your wife was right about you, he said. My wife is right about most things. It is her most inconvenient quality. Castellan laughed. It was the first time in recorded history that Lord Castellan had laughed in Caedric Ashcombe's presence, and Greaves made a private note of it, because Greaves noted everything and understood that some data points mattered more than their size suggested. Harwick and Drummond followed. Both departed with formal agreements of mutual defense, not the fear-based compliance Caedric had previously extracted, but negotiated partnerships with terms, obligations, and the particular strength that came from alliances built on demonstrated reliability rather than demonstrated threat. The Crown's response arrived by messenger on the 5th day. A letter, carefully worded, formally recognizing the Duchess of Blackthorne and withdrawing Prince Adrian's claim. The language was diplomatic. The subtext was surrender. The Crown had calculated the cost of continuing hostilities against a duchy that had just defeated a royal force, assembled a coalition of Eastern lords, and exposed a conspiracy that implicated Crown-adjacent operatives, and determined that the cost exceeded the benefit by a margin too large to justify. Caedric read the letter in his study, set it on the desk, looked out the window at the northern mountains where snow was beginning to gather on the highest peaks, signaling the approach of winter with the patient inevitability of seasons that did not care about human politics. Seraphina found him there at dusk. She entered without knocking. The habit had solidified over the past days into something that was no longer a challenge to his authority, but an expression of a dynamic that had evolved past the need for permission. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair Beaumont had occupied for 9 years, and the act of occupying that space, deliberately, with full awareness of its history, communicated something that neither of them needed to articulate. "The East Wing repairs will take 3 months," she said. "I have drafted a reconstruction plan with Greaves. The structural assessments are complete." "You are rebuilding my fortress." "I am rebuilding our fortress. The distinction matters." Caedric looked at her. The bruise around her left eye had faded from purple to yellow. The cut had been stitched, a thin, precise line that would become a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. Her ribs were wrapped beneath the dark wool dress she wore, and she moved with the careful economy of a person managing pain through discipline rather than medication. She was, he thought, the most formidable thing he had ever encountered. Not because she was fearless, she was not. He had seen her hands tremble. He had read the letter she never finished. He knew that beneath the architecture of her composure existed the same wound that existed beneath his. The certainty that needing another person was an invitation for annihilation, reinforced by a lifetime of evidence that the certainty was correct. But she had chosen to need him anyway. That was the part he could not stop examining, not the intelligence she provided, or the alliances she built, or the political acumen she deployed with surgical precision. Those were capabilities. Valuable, irreplaceable capabilities, but capabilities nonetheless, at things she did rather than things she was. What she was, what she had proven in a burning room with a fire iron and a man twice her size, was someone who had looked at the full inventory of risks associated with trusting Caedric Ashcombe and decided that the risk was worth taking. Not because the odds were favorable, not because the calculation guaranteed survival, but because she had recognized in him something that no one else in the kingdom had ever bothered to look for. A man worth the gamble. Seraphina. She looked up from the reconstruction plans. Her eyes, whiskey-colored, sharp, permanently evaluating, met his with the direct focus she applied to everything, including him. "I read your letter," he said. She went still. Not defensive, not embarrassed. The stillness of a woman processing the fact that something she had written for no audience had been read by the one person it was about. "It was unfinished," she said. "Most honest things are." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had existed between them before. It was not tactical, not loaded, not the pressurized quiet of two people calculating their next moves. It was the silence of two people who had exhausted every defense mechanism they possessed and arrived, through 12 days of conspiracy and violence in a burning room and a battlefield, and the slow, relentless demolition of walls they had spent their entire lives building, at the place where the only thing left to say was the thing they had both been avoiding. "You wrote that we are both already destroyed," Caedric said. He leaned forward. His hands were on the desk, open, unguarded, a posture he had never adopted in this room because this room was where strategy happened, and strategy required closed hands and controlled surfaces. You were right. I was destroyed the night my father died. Everything I built after that, the control, the isolation, the walls, was not strength. It was wreckage organized into a shape that resembled function. Caedric, let me finish. His voice was quiet. Not the killing quiet, not the command quiet. The quiet of a man saying something for the first time and needing the silence around it to be complete enough to hold the weight. You came into my fortress carrying secrets and legal documents, and a plan so precise I am still not certain I have identified all of its components. You engineered your way into my life with the same ruthless efficiency I apply to everything in mine, and I should resent that. Every principle I have lived by says I should resent that. But you do not. I do not. Because what you engineered was not my destruction. It was the demolition of something that needed to be demolished, and I was never going to do it myself. Seraphina set down the reconstruction plans. She placed her hands flat on the desk, mirroring his posture, matching his vulnerability with her own in the deliberate architectural way she did everything. Her fingers were stained with ink. Her nails were short, practical, the hands of a woman who used them for work rather than decoration. I came to Blackthorne because you were the most powerful man who might protect me, she said. That is the truth. I will not retroactively romanticize my motivations to make them more palatable. I came for survival. I stayed for something else. What? The moment in the catacombs, after you killed Crane. You looked at me and I expected rage or threats or the particular cruelty that powerful men deploy against witnesses they cannot control. Instead, you looked at me like I was a problem you had not anticipated, not a threat, a problem. And in that distinction, in the gap between how every other man in the kingdom would have looked at me and how you actually did, I saw something I had never seen before. What did you see? A man who was so accustomed to controlling everything that he had no idea what to do with something he could not control. She paused. It was the most human thing I had ever witnessed from someone in your position, and I decided, in that moment, that a man capable of being disoriented by the unexpected was a man capable of changing, even if he did not know it yet. Caedric looked at her across the desk, where 9 years of false counsel had been delivered and 12 days of real partnership had been built. The firelight shifted across her face, illuminating the scar above her eye, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of determination that lived in her expression not as a performance but as a permanent feature of her architecture. He reached across the desk, took her hand. The gesture was not smooth, it was not practiced. It had the mechanical uncertainty of a man performing an action he had no muscle memory for, the physical equivalent of speaking a language he was learning in real time. Her hand was warm, calloused from riding, steady. She did not pull away. I do not know how to do this, he said. Any of it. The trust, the vulnerability, the act of allowing another person close enough to damage me. I have spent my entire life ensuring that the distance between myself and everyone else was large enough to survive. You are asking me to close that distance, and I need you to understand that every instinct I possess is screaming that closing it will kill me. I know. Her fingers tightened around his, not gently, with the firm, deliberate pressure of a woman who held things the way she did everything else, completely, without reservation, with full commitment to the consequences. I'm asking anyway. Why? Because I have spent my entire life building the same walls you built, and I am tired, Caedric. Not of surviving. I am good at surviving. I am tired of surviving alone. The room held them. The fire burned low. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall across Blackthorne's damaged walls, and rebuilt defenses and courtyard stones that had absorbed blood and rain and the footsteps of 7 generations of Ashcombes who had lived and governed and died within these walls without ever once admitting that the fortress they built to protect themselves had become the thing they needed protection from. Caedric stood, walked around the desk, stood in front of Seraphina with the conscious deliberation of a man crossing a threshold he understood to be irreversible. He pulled her to her feet. Carefully, her ribs were still wrapped, still healing, and the care he took with her body communicated something his words had not yet fully managed: that she was not an asset, not a strategic variable, not a piece of the political architecture he maintained through calculation and force. She was the reason the calculation had stopped mattering. He kissed her. It was not elegant. It was not cinematic. It was the kiss of two people who had arrived at each other through conspiracy, imprisonment, marriage, betrayal, fire, and war, and who understood that what they were doing was not the beginning of something new, but the acknowledgement of something that had been building since the moment a woman in silver silk walked into a catacomb and refused to look away from the worst thing a man was capable of. When they separated, Seraphina looked at him with eyes that were bright and wet and absolutely, fundamentally unafraid. "You're still the most ruthless man in the kingdom," she said, "and you are still the most dangerous woman in it." Then the kingdom should be terrified. The kingdom is already terrified. That is the only thing it has gotten right. Seraphina laughed. It was quiet, surprised. The sound of a woman who had not expected to laugh in this room, in this fortress, in the arms of a man who had imprisoned her 12 days ago and was now holding her with the desperate tenderness of someone who had just discovered that the most terrifying thing in the world was not vulnerability. It was the years he had wasted being afraid of it. Winter came to Blackthorne with the slow, relentless patience of seasons that did not negotiate. Snow covered the damaged east wing and the rebuilt outer walls, and the passage where Adrian's cavalry had been broken in 40 minutes of violence that historians would argue about for decades. The fortress operated, it functioned, but it functioned differently now, with a quality that the servants noticed first and the soldiers noticed second, and the visiting nobles noticed last because they were the least equipped to recognize what they were seeing. Blackthorne was no longer held together by fear. It was held together by a duchess who reviewed intelligence reports at breakfast, and a duke who had learned in the 12 hardest days of his life that the most dangerous thing a powerful man could do was not to conquer or to kill or to impose his will through force. It was to let someone in. The noble houses noticed, the crown noticed, the kingdom noticed, and the story that spread through courts and taverns and military barracks was not the story of a battle or a conspiracy or a political marriage designed to circumvent a royal claim. It was the story of a man who had been carved from iron and winter, and the particular loneliness of people who build walls so high they forget what sunlight looks like. And a woman who walked through every wall he had and did not stop until she found the part of him that was still capable of standing in the open air. Years later, when courtiers asked the Duchess of Blackthorne how she had survived a man the kingdom considered a monster, she would look at them with whiskey-colored eyes that missed nothing and say, "He was never a monster. He was a man who had been alone so long he forgot that alone was a choice. I simply reminded him that he could make a different one." And Caedric, standing in the hall of a fortress that had once been governed by fear and was now governed by something far more durable, would hear her say it. And he would not smile. He had never fully mastered smiling, and Seraphina had told him once that his attempt looked like a man trying to disarm a weapon with his face. But something would shift behind his eyes, something warm, something that had not existed before a woman in paste diamonds walked through his gates carrying secrets and legal documents, and the unshakable conviction that even the most ruthless man alive was capable of becoming something more than his own defenses. And Blackthorne Keep, standing against the northern mountains with snow on its walls and fire in its hearths, and the sound of two voices arguing strategy over breakfast echoing through corridors that had once known only silence and obedience, endured. Not because it was feared, because it was finally worth defending.